Hi everyone, welcome back to the Food Forest. A question I get asked all the time is, how do I amend my soils when I use a deep wood chip mulch method like the Back to Eden gardening method? So let's talk about that today. How do you not till but then still amend your soils? Stick around. So how do you amend your soils if you're using a deep wood chip mulch method like the Back to Eden method? That's essentially a no-till system. So how do you actually add fertility back to the system if you're not allowed to move the wood chips out of the way? And most importantly, not allowed to get the wood chips into the soil. There are gardening methods that do put wood into the soil. That's like a hugelkultur method. Those methods take a really long time to recover from the nitrogen tie-up that happens when you bury carbon into the ground. Those beds can become tremendously productive down the road, but they take a couple years and you might kill your garden for a couple years. Often people will do the Back to Eden method and they'll till wood chips into their soil, and then it doesn't work and their garden is really bad for the first year because of all the nitrogen tie-up. So their plants are nitrogen deficient and they say, see, it didn't work. Okay, so a deep wood chip mulch method is largely used for growing woody based perennials like trees and bushes. We go with deep wood chips because fungus likes wood chips. Trees actually want a fungal dominated soil. Now, believe it or not, underneath this food forest patch here is the same thick wood chip mulch. And the plants are loving it because they're bushes, trees, and technically, I mean, even the comfrey's loving it. It's a herbaceous plant. But they really like that fungal dominated soil. And you wouldn't know there's a thick layer of wood chips here, but there is. Now, green leafy plants like grasses and clovers, they actually like bacterial dominated soil. And so they actually prefer to be amended not so much with wood chips, but with compost and manure. Okay, so here's our annual garden bed. And we've got our horse manure and compost mix right there next to it. So how do I amend my annual beds with manure if I'm not allowed to move the wood chips? The short answer is there's really three ways you can do this, and each of them have their pros and cons. Let's talk about the first one. A wholesale scrape and removal of the wood chips, and then putting compost on, and then remulching back on top. Okay, now if you're growing an annual garden bed and you're done for the season, and the fall, what you can do is actually scrape away all the wood chips, pull them right off. With a big rake, you can scrape them all off. You can put down 2 or 3 inches of compost on top, and then you can replace the wood chips. And this way you at least didn't disturb the soil, and you can amend an entire garden bed in one go with just pulling the mulch back, putting the compost or amendments you want on, and then recovering it, giving it a good nice water, and then letting it mature and sit over the entire winter so that it's ready again in the spring. Okay, now that can be difficult if you do a polyculture garden kind of like I do. These kales were actually planted in the late fall specifically to feed rabbits. So I wanted to have something in here that the rabbits would actually eat so that they don't eat my fruit trees and bushes. And it was actually tremendously successful, and the rabbits manured this entire garden, just wild rabbits. So if you're planting stuff into it that's going to last through the fall, it's going to be hard for you to rake everything back without damaging some of the plants that you're planting. The reason why we're putting the wood chips down is to help build the fungal mycelium, the mushroom network. Even though green leafy plants like bacterial dominated soils, they still want fungus. They want intact fungus. That mycelial network actually transports nutrients and water from plant to plant. If a certain plant, say, was a tomato and it created a calcium deficiency in the soil in one area, but there was an excess of calcium in another area, the mushroom net will actually transfer the calcium from one area over to the tomatoes. So it's really important that we keep that mushroom network alive and functioning. And if we rake back the wood chips and destroy that network, then we're kind of setting ourselves back. We're not doing whole-scale tilling, but we're kind of tilling specifically for the mushroom layer. Now, when I'm talking about destroying the mushroom mycelia, there's a whole bunch of different types of mushrooms. There's saprophytic mushrooms, which break apart wood chips, turn that into soil. There's also mycorrhizal mushrooms, which basically connect the roots of plants and do that nutrient exchange, water exchange, and information exchange. There's also parasitic mushrooms. There's a whole bunch of different types of mushrooms. So when we're raking back the wood chip mulch layer, we're kind of interrupting that saprophyte mushroom that's breaking apart the wood chips and the mulch and turning it into soil. We're not so much breaking apart that mycorrhizal network that's actually inside the soil level. So ideally, we're not disturbing any of it, but if we're going to disturb any of it, at least only disturb the mulch layer and also as little as possible. But really try to not disturb the soil, the ground level. And that's really that mycorrhizal network that we really depend on. You have to plant plants, so you're going to do some disturbance as long as you understand we're really trying to minimize the disturbance we do. Okay, the second method that you can use is basically taking advantage of when you're planting. Okay, so in the spring, when we come and plant our new plants, like when I planted these sorrel here, now these are perennials, these will actually keep coming back up, but when I planted this sorrel, I had to dig into the soil. And when I'm digging into the soil, that's a good opportunity for me to amend at least the area, the local area where I'm planting that plant. So I rake back the wood chips, you get access to the soil level, you plant in the soil, but then you also amend some new compost into it. And when you're planting stuff like annual veggies like lettuces, they tend to be spaced fairly close together, so little pockets of compost all through the garden. Over the years, the planting locations will differ slightly, and you'll end up kind of amending your entire garden. It's not perfect, but at least for the most part, you're leaving that fungal mycelial network alive and functioning, and you're operating as a no-till. So the pros to the amend as you plant method is that you are minimizing the disturbance to the soil and, importantly, to the fungal network. The cons is that you're just not really amending that much, and you're also localizing the amendment right to the plant itself that you're planting. Now, the third method, and the one that I personally use, is a very frequent but very small addition of compost to the garden. In this method, we basically wait the day before a rainfall, an expected rainfall, and we give a very light dusting of compost or manure right on top of the wood chips. The rains will wash it all down, worms will come up, they'll grab it at night and they'll eat it, and then they'll go back down into the soils and they'll poop it back out under the ground in the soils. And in this way, we basically are using biology to do the tilling for us. Many gardeners actually mulch with their compost and grow in their mulch. A farmer who's kind of famous for this is Charles Dowding, and he says that in his area he can't use wood chip mulch because he'll get tons of slugs. Now, we have tons of slugs, and I don't find that that's a problem, so make sure that it's a problem for you before you think you have to solve a problem that doesn't exist. So for him, he doesn't use wood chips at all. He puts, I believe, 2 inches of compost down every single year, and that's his mulch layer. And then he also grows in his mulch layer. And then the next season he just does the same thing and the same thing, and he just adds compost down. Now, if you're growing pure annual garden beds, try that method out. You can also try this method out and see what works best. I like this method because it stores and holds more moisture and it builds a tighter, more robust fungal network. Try half your bed with one method and half your bed with the other method and see what works best for you. That's what life's all about, trying everything and using your own information to see what works best on your site, in your soil, in your weather, in your insect load, in your soil chemistry, in your weather patterns, in your rainfall. What happens and works well in one site at my house may not work as well at your site in your house. So try it all. And one last thing, don't overlook the importance of the fertility event that is rain. Every single rainfall event is a fertilization event. A lot of people think that rainwater, being H2O, is adding hydrogen and oxygen to your soils. But when a rain droplet is falling through the air, it's surrounded by nitrogen. And if you look at it under a microscope, you have a boundary layer between the raindrop and the atmosphere, and there's a gas exchange that happens there. It's basically called atmospheric scrubbing. So when that rainfall falls down through a blanket of nitrogen, it actually absorbs and picks nitrogen up inside the rain droplet. That is now bringing nitrogen down into your soils. So if your garden is not set up to stop, slow, hold, and sink that water when it falls, then you're not fertilizing your beds to the extent that you could. Now, if compost was falling out of the sky and landing on your land and then running across your land, and you had a flow of compost from up above you coming down through your land and then going out the bottom of your land, and you had this wave of compost flowing across your land, you might think, hey, I should probably capture some of that compost. I spend so much time and effort making it. I spend so much time and effort putting it into my gardens. As that compost is washing across my land, I should stop it and I should use it. The thing is rainwater is a much higher fertilization event than any compost amendment that you can add. So if you're not thinking about stopping, slowing, holding, spreading, sinking that water, then you're basically letting that free compost flow outside of your garden system. The slope of this land goes like this. So water that wants to run hits this garden bed, gets stopped and sinks into it. Any that falls here flows like this, hits this garden bed, stops and sinks into it. It's all about stopping, holding, and slowing and spreading that water. Any extra, if we have flooding, comes actually here. It comes and collects into this, which is a swale. So the back side of this is a little trench, and it's all on equal contour, and it goes right down the side of my property. And this is a berm, so it's a little hill. So any rainwater excess comes in here, pools in this little swale, and then slowly sinks into the land. And you can see the fertility of this area. I actually can't stop it from growing. It's so fertile, and it's because every rain event is a fertility event. Similarly, you can see these garden beds, they're right along contour. So any rain that falls and flows, they hit these beds here and they get stuck and held in it, and then we absorb it in mulch. I do have to have this walking path going down so I can get to the back side of that, but then this downhill side, this back side, it is also a swale. So any rainwater that does come down through here is held here, and all these plants can access it. So this is how we really have to design our gardens to take them to the next level, because we have to capture as much of that free water as we can.